Hey everybody, and welcome into the Knowledge Pool. This is your host, Matt, and I normally would not put things on in this format. I've been thinking about what I want to do for this channel for a long time. I've been trying to figure out what I want to do to make things nice for people who come in and watch. But for today, I feel like we just need to get something out onto the field and talk a little bit about ban cards. So this is Tuesday, November 19th, right after the ban of Oko, Once Upon a Time, and Veil of Summer in Standard, along with Field of the Dead, which has been banned for a few weeks. I want to talk a little bit about what makes a banned card worthy of banning while we talk about the implications of what's been going on. Now, just in case you haven't been keeping up with the Standard scene, Field of the Dead was banned a few weeks ago, right after a major tournament where about half of the player base was playing Field of the Dead decks. There were other kind of decks built specifically to deal with Field of the Dead, either go over or go under. A lot of talk of banning Oko at the time had to do with the fact that it was playing well against Field of the Dead where a lot of things weren't. And with Field of the Dead, I feel we hit our real big idea of why this is a bannable card. In Standard, you never want an atmosphere that feels oppressive. Standard is sort of the go-to area for people to get into Magic. And whether or not you agree on whether or not it's a good format or the best format or whatever, it certainly is the one that tends to attract people when they first come into Magic. It's got an easy starting point. It has a relatively low starting cost, although there's arguments against that. And there's also just sort of a feeling of accessibility, which you don't get in other formats that people tend to explore. So starting in Standard, you want there to be an atmosphere that you can play something you brought and do relatively okay. In that notion, competitive Standard also doesn't want an oppressive atmosphere because casual players tend to lean toward the decks that competitive players play. And if you are a jank homebrewer, kudos to you. I really think that it's an amazing thing to sit and back and build. But in general, if you're new, you want to get in looking at the stuff that people have built in the past. You're going to look toward the people who are good at the game and go, that looks like a good deck, I'm going to build that. Field of the Dead had problems within the current Standard because of its inability to interact, I should say. Field of the Dead is when it enters the battlefield, or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 zombie creature token. Since there is little to no land destruction in Standard during this time period, we are stuck in the notion that once Field of the Dead is on the board, it's on the board. And as soon as your opponent has 7 or more land, assuming your opponent is playing Field of the Dead, they're probably going to have the different lands, and they're going to be able to create 2/2 zombies just for playing the game. Anytime that you can do something just for playing the game, you don't have to work for it, you don't have to give anything to it, you are in a situation of inability to interact. They can't destroy it, they just got to deal with it. And Field of the Dead was worth banning. I personally thought that maybe Field of the Dead would be okay if they ended up banning Golos, a card that allowed you to search for Field of the Dead. Or maybe cut out some of the low mana cost land searching to try to take out the legs, so to speak. But this card in the end is in a situation that it created an unfun problem for Standard. And in the end, people want to play Standard in an accessible way, and this led to little interactivity that caused a problem. It being banned makes 100% sense. So, talking about the new 3 cards on the ban list, we have Oko Thief of Crowns, Once Upon a Time, and Veil of Summer. After Field of the Dead was banned, there became a surge of players playing what they called Oko decks. They generally had green, blue, and maybe another color, usually black. And they centered around getting these heavy hits in or controlling the board until you couldn't control it anymore and then just swinging out for damage. Now, me personally, I was unsure about the Oko Thief of Crowns ban, and I know a lot of people out there who are watching this video and people who aren't watching this video had ideas that it's like Oko Thief of Crowns, too good, and definitely needs to be banned because it was creating the same kind of atmosphere that Field of the Dead was creating. But Field of the Dead was one card that a suite built around created an oppressive nature. In the same way, Oko is a suite of cards that created an oppressive nature. Oko by himself, is he a bannable card? That's when we get into the real definitions of what makes bannable. Let's look at the other 2 cards that got banned during this last set of bannings. Once Upon a Time is a spell that costs 1 and a green, and if it's the first spell that you've cast in the game, it costs nothing. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put a creature or land card from among them into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. A lot of players are asking why Once Upon a Time has been banned. If you are a casual player, you might have looked at this and thought, why is this banned? This card creates a consistency nature in tandem with the other cards that are really good in green right now. Golden Goose is a mana dork, as we call them inside of the field, a creature that taps for resources. With a 1-cost creature that taps for resources, you create a situation, especially any color resource, where the player playing that deck can consistently get whatever color they need on turn 2 as a regular basis. They can search for a land, they can search for this dork, and they have plenty of cards in their decks, a suite of cards in their deck, built around getting the colors that they need when they need to get them. This card by itself makes green splashable in any color combination that you're looking for, because even if you're not running green at all, you can still run Once Upon a Time. Sure, you might only run 2 copies and one of them is going to be a dead card after the first time you use it, but the idea being that if you need it, it's in your hand as a free get what you want card, and that is a very, very consistent deck. So green being splashable by Once Upon a Time shows what makes this particular card a bannable card. Its accessibility and consistency creates an oppressive nature, because what deck doesn't like to tutor? And this is essentially a land or creature tutor for whatever you don't have in your hand, creating a fairly consistent situation. Veil of Summer is the other card that got banned, and this one ties more closely to Oko, but it was also banned in other formats that also have banned Oko. It says, It's 1 green as an instant. Draw a card if an opponent has cast a blue or black spell. Spells you control can't be countered this turn, and you and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue or black until end of turn. Why is blue or black important? Well, the first and obvious reason is that Oko is blue. So Veil of Summer will shut down Oko's abilities on being used on you by giving you hexproof. It also makes it so the turn that someone plays an Oko, you can draw a card, which is a bonus. But I think the main reason that this is important is the black part. We haven't talked about black and we don't have a card up, but there is a card called Noxious Grass, a 1 and a black instant that kills a green or white planeswalker or creature, and the player gains 2 life. Or 1 life, I'm not certain. People were playing Noxious Grasp in their main deck because they knew that they were going to run into Oko decks. At the last competitive event, as people like to say, 69% of the decks were running Oko, and that is 100% true. 69% of the decks running Oko means even if you run a card that normally is not good for a main deck scenario, you've got better than a 50-50 chance that it's going to be useful on game 1, which makes it a playable in the main deck. So people playing Noxious Grasp in their main deck allowed them to play Oko and try to keep their opponent's deck off of Oko. Now, Veil of Summer created another situation in which you could basically stop your opponent from being able to use their kill spell on Oko or any of your other permanents or hexproof. And so you could play green and green blue and green blue black, which tended to be the color choices of most food decks, without worrying about what your opponent was going to do to get rid of stuff because they couldn't target it. You have Veil of Summer. Hyper efficient mana cost, really good effect. Not something you would main board in a standard where you didn't feel like everyone was running a particular thing, but with the high number of green-blue decks there were, using this card in a main board protected your green-blue deck from the only thing that was tending to counter it, blue and black generally. So, what does all this mean? Going back to Oko. Oko is a card that creates a problem when in tandem with the other cards in this thing. Once Upon a Time can search for our mana dork, the Goose, creating a situation where your opponent can get Oko out on turn 2. A turn 2 planeswalker is very, very hard to get around, and this planeswalker in particular is very hard to get around because it has 2+ abilities, meaning that whether it wants to create a food token to give you more resources to do things, or turn an artifact or creature into a 3/3 elk with no abilities, both will raise its loyalty counters, creating a situation where it's harder to kill them. Generally, turn 3 planeswalkers tend to start at 4, but their plus ability usually only gives +1, if that, and it usually has a middle ability with a minus on it, so that if you use them right away when they come out, they tend to be a one-hit wonder. They get their effect off, but they're likely to die in the next turn. Oko doesn't have that problem. It is a very, very, very effective card. It being banned along with these 2 cards makes me wonder about the structure of the way that we do bannings. Why would we ban Oko instead of, say, Goose, which created the situation that you can get a turn 2 Oko on the field in the first place? A lot of heavy players will often talk about 1-cost mana dorks and say that they aren't good for the format. I've seen it within Twitch streamers. I've seen it amongst competitive players that aren't in Twitch. I've seen it even with casual players who don't really even realize what they're saying, just going, hey, that's not fair. They got a turn 5 card out on turn 3. Along with Oko, is Nissa Who Shakes the Ground, a 5-cost planeswalker that under the right circumstances can get out on the board on turn 3 and has devastating abilities when it hits the board. There's Wicked Wolf, which plays well with Oko and creates situations that green has a very good removal kit, which is not one of green's strong suits. All of these cards are pairing together to create this situation. Now, just like I said with Field of the Dead required a suite in order to make it oppressive. And at the end of the day, it's easier to ban the 1 card, Field of the Dead, than it is to ban a complete suite of cards that might make the deck lose its legs, but also the inability to interact with has created a situation where maybe you don't want to do that. Oko Thief of Crowns has the same situation going on. A great power base, something to work with, and unfortunately, I think it's slightly too hyper-aggressive mana cost. And at some point, if people were into it, I'd love to go over what they could have done to make Oko a little more balanced. If you would like to see that, leave a comment below. But in the meantime, banning Oko seemed like the safest solution and the best idea. So what implications does this have for blue and green as a format deck? In Standard right now, there was more than one blue-green deck. Blue-green-black was sort of the popular one off of the last Mythic Championship. Sultai was running rampant because you could run blue and green and black, you could run your Noxious Grasps, but you also were running the basic Oko food kit with Once Upon a Time, with Veil of Summer, with Goose, with Wicked Wolf, all these cards I've been mentioning, Nissa Who Shakes the Ground, and it's a very competitive high-level deck. Another high-level deck that's been very good in green-blue has been Simek Flash. Simek Flash is playing creatures and instants only on your opponent's turn, so that you can create a situation that once they play something, you can react entirely, but you still have all of the things that you need. Simek Flash would use Once Upon a Time, certainly. Veil of Summer, maybe. But its general suite tended to deal with counterspells and flash creatures. And those counterspells and flash creatures are still in the game, as is Hydrokrasis, which was a big green-blue card for any Simek set. When you cast a spell, you gain X life and draw half X cards, where its cost is X green and a blue. So if you put 4 into X, you're gaining 2 life and getting 2 cards. If you put 6 in, you're getting 3 life and drawing 3 cards, etc. It has flying, it has trample, and it comes out with the full number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to X. So if you put 2 in, it gets 2, and you got 1 life and 1 card, even if it never hits the board. This card creates a situation where your entire hand and life total can be reused and reabused as long as you have ramp. If you have Nissa that Shakes the Ground, which is a green card that was good in an Oko deck, you have ramp. If you have Goose, you have ramp. If you have Arboreal Grazer, which some people were planning to use if they didn't ban Oko and instead ban Goose, you have ramp. It's very easy to set up a situation where you can continually put down land cards right now and make Hydrokrasis as big as it can possibly be. Why is this card not banned? because even within its suite, it does not create a situation most of the time that just means your opponent wins. It is not oppressive enough to create that situation. So green-blue is probably going to be okay. It's going to be in a different form. It's not going to be necessarily food-based or fight-based, creating removal kits. Instead, its removal is going to be based around the things that it does well. Another sort of argument when it comes to what ban cards mean is the value lost. Now, here in Arena, all of our cards come from digital packs or they come from wild cards. A certain rarity of wild card is used to make a certain rarity of card. When you as a player make that wild card, you are committing a wild card that you have, a finite resource, to making a card. But on Arena, if a card gets banned, they refund you wild cards equal to the number of that card that you have in your collection. So when this ban hit, the Veil of Summer Once Upon a Time Oko ban, I got 4 uncommons, 4 rares, and 4 mythics in my wildcard set. This created a situation where I have plenty of stuff to play with, and if I want to build new cards, I can. Now, for a paper player, they invest a lot of money into making the big deck, and that deck can only be valuable as long as the cards in it are playable. Oko has been banned in multiple formats. Veil of Summer has been banned in multiple formats, and what was a $7 uncommon will eventually go to dirt, or it'll only keep value because of use in Commander or other things that doesn't ban as hard these competitive cards. It means a lot to a player when they put a lot of money into a card like Oko Thief of Crowns and then it gets banned. They feel like they've been cheated out of however much money they spent in order to play a deck that's competitive. One of the things that is important to remember when you talk about whether or not you're happy about the ban or what you think is that some newer player didn't pick up Oko in order to be oppressive. They picked up Oko because they saw it on a website and they thought that it was an okay deck, that, you know, it had a high win rate, and they were just trying to make sure that they were going in with the best advantages possible, since their inexperience is a disadvantage, and they blew a bunch of money on something that is no longer worth anything. Now, maybe they'll be able to sell it and get some worth out of it, but usually the value cut is pretty high. And for a new player, it's pretty damaging to come in and having bought something new and then immediately having to buy something else new in order to continue playing. This is why bans are careful and they are measured and they do their best to try to cover the bases that they absolutely need to cover, rather than just banning anything that seems too aggressive. These are just a few of my thoughts on the ban and what they mean, and I hope that you guys enjoy this. I hope you have questions. Please, if you have questions, leave them in the comments. We might do a follow-up if there's something that I forgot to cover. My apologies for the audio and the sickness. I woke up this morning thinking that this was going to be fine, and I think that overall it went well. Welcome back to the Knowledge Pool. I hope that you continue to think critically about the Magic that you're playing and continue to be a good sport across all forms of games. Thank you for your time.